you, Amy. A couple of things. The picture of the pelican on the one slide was a nice touch. And Adeline, I have to say, you did an incredible job reading that story. Wow. Yeah, absolutely. And congratulations again on the Lilly grant. That is just marvelous. At the very beginning here, I want to acknowledge the context of this sermon because it's important. It's been a tough 3 or 4 weeks. It's actually been a tough longer than that, but it seems like the last 3 or 4 weeks have been particularly tough. Of course, there's the COVID-19 pandemic. With that came increasing reports of economic disruption, jobs lost, lives upended. On top of which then, photo after photo showed people ignoring medical advice to mask up and maintain physical distance, which at least for me was incredibly frustrating. Others of us are still fearful of going out even though we can. Then there was the announcement from the UUA that we may be virtual for at least another year, and as we just heard, doing some kind of a hybrid thing. As if that weren't enough, then revelations of police brutality began to tumble over each other, seemingly more every day in the wake of the police murder of George Floyd. Protests turned violent and more people died, and concerns about disease transmission at protests themselves came up. Trump called for the use of whatever force was necessary to quell the protests, including a threat to call up the military. Please. We know that the pandemic and the frustration of people of color are related. They intersect. People in marginalized communities, marginalized individuals are most at risk from the virus, and they're the least likely to be able to find appropriate care or to be given appropriate care. They're most impacted by the economic fallout. They're the most likely to suffer food insecurity. So those two things are just really tied in together so much. Those are all important, and they must be lifted up, and they are being lifted up. Prophetic voices are rising. People are taking action. This feels different. I've lived through a fair number of these things, and this one feels different. Hopefully it will be. But I want to focus on something different this morning, because I believe that we all need a chance to let go, to relax. And so it's that I want to focus in on this morning. My own love of tramping around in the outdoors began with my maternal grandmother. She and my grandfather lived in a small farming community. That far back, most farmers didn't care at all if we wandered through their fields and woodlots and along their creeks, as long as we closed the gates behind us so that the cows didn't escape. Those long, rambling walks with her were sheer joy. No one else was especially interested in accompanying us, so it also gave me some really good one-on-one time with the woman who was one of the very, very bright spots in my life growing up. Mama, we all called her Mama, knew stuff. She knew the names of plants, their local names, and she often knew their more scientific names as well. It was clear without her saying it explicitly that they were a part of her world, not just accessories to it. They were part of who she was. She knew trees, whether in the spring by their budding leaves or in the depths of winter by their bark and their shapes. She knew where to look to help me find the nests the birds built in them. She could distinguish similar flowers, one from the other. Those early rambles with my grandmother evolved into the natural world being one of the primary things that I turned to for emotional and spiritual sustenance. The natural world offers abundant insights and comfort. There are many compelling reasons for preserving the natural world, especially in places that can remain relatively untouched by human encroachment. But the gifts it offers, the insights, the sustenance for mind and heart, are among the most compelling for me. It was Henry David Thoreau who said, in wilderness is the salvation of the world. It holds out hope for us humans who occupy it too. One of the joys of the house in Florida, where Tom and I have lived the past several winters for a few weeks, is that it's less than a mile up the road from the Pelican Island National Wildlife Refuge, hence the Pelican Island Wisdom theme. We were there one afternoon this past February, and I again admired the boardwalk that had been constructed to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the refuge movement. The boardwalk's planks are engraved with the names, locations, and founding dates of many of the National Wildlife Refuge properties in the United States and its territory. The walkway has several lovely places to stop and take in the view across the water to Pelican Island itself, and to contemplate the vision that started it all in 1903. President Theodore Roosevelt established Pelican Island National Wildlife Refuge along Florida's central Atlantic coast on March 14, 1903, simply by an executive order. It would be misleading, however, to conclude that this was the beginning of wildlife sanctuaries in the United States in any concerted sense. The history of the refuge system actually reminds me of nothing so much as the 5th chapter of the book of Genesis. That's the one, if you remember, it's the one with all the begats. What is notable is that the wildlife refuge system has been largely the work of concerned citizen activists. When I began researching the origin of the refuge system, I went looking for that one single declaration or act of Congress that set the whole thing in motion. It doesn't exist. It didn't begin with an act of Congress, but with a lot of ordinary people in different locations, occasionally working together, but often not, people who shared a common commitment to saving endangered species and preserving habitat. The refuge system points up how much citizen activists can do, whether it's preserving wild places and the beings who call them home, wearing a mask and maintaining distance to lessen the spread of COVID-19, rebuilding a shattered economy, or helping to alleviate centuries of racial injustice. We are not powerless. We can't do it all, but we can do something. And we're called to do what we can, where we can. Meanwhile, the natural world itself offers us strength for the journey. The first insight that I want to highlight comes from UU writer Ruth Gibson in a short piece entitled Learning from Daffodils. And I'm paraphrasing her writing in spots here anyway. When you look at a daffodil, there are lots of things you notice. Almost no one ever notices the little brown withered bit at the base of the flower. But it's really important. When the daffodils come up, the ground is still pretty hard and there is sometimes cold and snow. So at first, the daffodils have a tough green skin protecting their blossoms. Well, after it gets warmer, the daffodils don't need this protection and they shrivel and die. Sometimes in our lives, just as for the daffodil, some part of us needs to shrivel up and die so that some new part of us can grow. Oddly enough, though, the dead, shriveled up part of a daffodil doesn't fall away. It stays. We can hold on to those shriveled up, deadly bits of our own lives, especially if doing so helps us to remember, to honor, and to value all parts of ourselves, all parts of our experience. Just because we don't need that part or that way of being in the world now, it doesn't mean that part has no value. It was very necessary to have that protection at the time, and very good to remember and appreciate it now. Second, I've also learned about resilience from the natural world. And this time, right outside my laundry room window. We have a Japanese maple that thrives in that location. It had just leafed out when we had the late freeze a few weeks ago. And within a couple of days, its leaves had withered, and a stiff wind one night blew most of them off the tree, and most of them had become a rather unpleasant brown mush around the base of the tree. A couple of weeks later, though, my husband noticed that there were tiny new leaf buds forming on many of those branches. Those buds have now developed into shiny, dark red leaves, small but persistent, and they're actually not, they're not so small anymore. The natural world, though, also tells us a cautionary tale at this point. There is a limit to resilience, to bouncing back from adversity. Last winter, we lost all of our daffodils and most of the ornamental grass in our front yard and most of our coral bells. I think there might have been one lonely coral bell left. There are limits to resistance in the natural world that suggest that we need to recognize and honor the limits to our own resilience. Take care of ourselves. In what is perhaps a similar vein, the world of nature reminds us that pain and suffering do exist, and they are sometimes, in fact, unavoidable. And sometimes we can fix it, and sometimes can't. When I lived in the country, we had a huge tray bird feeder that was the gathering place for a seemingly limitless number of birds of many, many varieties. There was also an old wild apple tree that grew by the river. And there was the hawk. He sat in the old apple tree with a watchful eye on the feeder. And every so often, he swooped in with lightning precision to feast on whomever was feasting at the feeder. I was horrified and I was outraged. Of course, the hawk needed to eat. I get that, and he deserved to eat. But he didn't have to regard my bird feeder as his personal cafeteria. Well, hawks have to dive in to grab their prey. They have to come in from the top. And we made a chicken wire baffle to prevent his strike dive while giving the rest of the birds easy access to the seed. He could eat somewhere else. There's a lot we can do to mitigate pain and suffering, but there are limits too. It wasn't that the hawk wasn't going after birds. It was just he was going after birds someplace else. He gave up after about a week or so and left. There's also, though, infinite beauty and joy to find for those who have eyes to see and ears to hear, who are willing to slow down and observe, to look with fresh eyes, to see from an unaccustomed perspective, to look in places that perhaps aren't obvious. Kelly Phillips, who's the outreach coordinator for the Redtail Conservancy, wrote this recently about bees and dandelions. Queen bees awake early in spring. Using short but sturdy legs, a queen bumblebee wiggles her way out of the warming soil. With hibernation done at long last, it's time to find some food. Looking around with her compound eyes, she sees her favorite color, purple. Her instinct to find the ultraviolet beckoning of purple blossom. Her instinct is to find the ultraviolet beckoning of purple blossoms that must mean sweet nectar. Wings buzzing, she lifts off and flies for 10 seconds or so. No purple flowers. After resting, she flies again, but for 20 seconds. No purple flowers. Desperate and hungry, she lands on a soft pad. It doesn't have the violet light she is looking for, but it definitely holds some flower nectar. Food. In all directions, as far as she can see and smell, there are these wide yellow flowers. Huzzah, she must think. There's something to feast on while she grows stronger. Though this bumblebee may not recognize Taraxacum officinale, the common dandelion, it has saved her nonetheless. Dandelions are easily one of the most helpful plants to many pollinators. In early spring, flowers can go from seed to bloom in days. Unfortunately, for over 100 species of insects, including the humble bumblebee, that time aligns with the end of overwintering and hibernation. Each flower has 40 to 100 florets, smaller flowers, each with pollen and nectar. Wildlife can fill up without spending more energy than necessary traveling to other flowers. Along with our queen bumblebee, solitary bees and honeybees visit dandelions for food. Hovering flies, beetles, and butterflies use them as well. The flower's long growing season ensures food for pollinators like the holly blue butterfly, whose species emerge in early spring and again at the end of summer. The dandelion seeds are nutritious food for birds such as goldfinches, greenfinches, and redpolls. Hummingbirds use soft dandelion down to line their small nests. The low-growing leaves are a safe, shady space for beetles and lizards. The queen bumblebee also spends time on the jagged-edged leaves, resting between short, energy-draining flights. Parenthetical comment here, you may have seen this. Bumblebees are those creatures that, in terms of when aerodynamic engineers look at them, they ought not to be able to fly. They were just not designed for flight, but fly they do. Back to Kelly's story. Creatures beneath the ground benefit from the dandelion's roots. The long taproot pulls nutrients out of this, like calcium and potassium, from deep in the soil. The nutrients become available to plants whose shallow roots provide food to other plants and voles, small burrowing mammals. Thick, hardy roots loosen packed soil, which makes movement for worms easier. The worms, in turn, provide food for birds and improve the health of the soil. The roots of this plant interconnect with roots from other plants, and this network strengthens the ground from erosion as the water passes through the soil. Minimizing the amount of soil that enters our waterways keeps sediment levels low. A high amount of sediment or particles in the soil make it difficult for fish to breathe. By late summer, the dandelion's blooming season is starting to slow. The queen bumblebee has established a hive in the hollow of a fallen oak tree. Nearby is a meadow of soft, yellow flowers that provided safety and food for her before her preferred native flowers bloomed. In a few months, new queens will overwinter with the promise of dandelions nearby. Now, how many of us have managed to look at a dandelion from this angle of vision before? I certainly haven't, especially those of us who live in the burbs where appropriate lawn covering is not considered to be dandelions. In sum, in terms of kind of at least what the out of doors does for me, medical experts keep telling us repeatedly that it's safe to get outdoors, taking appropriate precautions, and it's highly beneficial to do so. It's one way we have of helping ourselves in these challenging times. We can, as the psalmist suggests, go to the mountains and get their glad tidings. Now, okay, I know, we're hard put to find mountains in Indiana, but that's true, even if our mountains are simply our own neighborhood or our local park. And I see that we're wrapping up a bit early. When we're finished, take advantage of the time to go out and find your own outdoor space. Thank you.